As Dr. Ugolo said, the title is Excavating Tel Gezer, an Israelite Royal City. And before I get going, though, I would like to thank Dr. Ugolo and Dr. McElhaney, not just for having me, but for having this type of conference. It's really rare in our denomination to have something like this and to have your ancient studies program. And it's really a fantastic program and conference that they've built, not because they invited me, but just because of so you can hear these type of speakers and get this type of information and have options for chapel, which is fantastic as well. And also to thank Eric Welch, since he introduced me here, and also is kind of my archaeological big brother, father, something like that. I'll let him choose his familial title to me later. And SAGU for having us and hosting this fantastic event. What you see here is the cover of Near Eastern Archaeology, which is an archaeological publication. And on the cover is Tel Gezer, and that was from a couple of years ago. And the dig, just as we go forward, is led by the Tandy Institute, which is our archaeological institute out of Fort Worth at Southwestern. And those are the consortium member schools listed there. Since they pay money, they get to have their name on a slide. This is just to show you how a tel works. If you've seen Eric's presentations before, this is actually his slide. And basically, a tel is a mound. It's an artificial mound of civilization. And as you dig down, you typically get earlier and earlier in civilization. So I've put some round dates up there. It doesn't exactly work like that. In 1200, they didn't wake up and say, well, now we're in the Iron Age. We better change what we do. But these are round dates, and you see the patriarchs moving through the Middle Bronze Age if you're looking for an estimated date, and you have David and Solomon starting at the beginning of that Iron II in the 10th century, which we will talk quite a bit a lot today. The Iron I is roughly the period of the Judges. But that's just going forward, so you kind of understand some of the dates we're working with. Tel Gezer is not too far from Tel Asaphi, so if a lot of you have heard Eric speak before, you're familiar with the Shfela. The Shfela are the low rolling hills that come right after the Philistine coastal plain. That's from the Mediterranean Sea. You have the coastal plain, the Shfela, the rolling hills, to the central hills that lead up to Jerusalem, and then to the Jordan River and the Rift Valley, and on the other side, of course, Jordan, where you have Moab and Edom. Gezer, as you can see on that map, is north of Gath, and it's approximately, although not exactly, about halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, about 18 miles northwest of Jerusalem. It's good to remember when we're talking about biblical history, the history of ancient Israel or Palestine, just how small the country is. In shape, size, form, it's about the size of New Jersey. So it's incredibly small when you compare it. You know, when prophets are traveling from one city to another, or kings are going on campaigns, a lot of times they're not traveling great distances. And as with a lot of sites, they're built there for natural resources, but with Gezer, it's a little different. They don't have great natural resources, but it's on a very strategic point. This map doesn't show roadways or road systems, but all along the Mediterranean Sea, along the coast, you have the Via Maris, which is the coastal highway, and then you have the highway that goes transverse across the country to Jerusalem right at Gezer. So it's right on that junction from Jerusalem to the coast and the coast all the way up and down. So when anyone's coming out of Egypt or coming from the north, they're going to pass through or by Gezer, so it gets trampled on a lot. Kind of on that same thread, you do have Gezer as a true border site. Throughout its biblical history and just history as an historical site, it changes people and alliances and culture quite often. You can't really nail down who owns Gezer at what time. The biblical text is somewhat unclear. It's given to the Israelites. They conquer it, but they don't kill everyone. Then the Philistines are there. It's not exactly certain, and you see this a lot in your Bible maps. If you open up, if you have any of the Bible atlases and you look for Gezer, it's going to be right on the border, either just inside or just outside Israel, Judah, and Philistia, since it's on the border of all three. And in fact, on the map on the left is a map of approximated of Saul's kingdom that's listed in the text when he takes over, when Saul becomes king. And at this time, they have Gezer just outside. But as you move through history, it either gets enveloped or it's back and forth. Eric mentioned that yesterday with Telasophy, how Gath was conquered and became a Judite site, which is why it's not mentioned in Zephaniah. And with Gezer, you see that same thing. Because it's a border site, it often switches alliances or who controls it. And that's a big question for our research too, is, who is ethnically at Gezer? At a site like Gath, the Philistines, and you have lots of the pottery, and you have there's specific types of ovens, and you have other things that tell you about who was there. But it's not always so easy to tell ethnically when you have just a mix of material culture. Have you heard other sites being discussed or taught? The identification of a site usually takes up a decent portion of it. You're just trying to figure out, based on biblical or historical texts, what the site is. When you hear the project on Telasophy, Aaron Mayer, the leader of the project, always jokes, we don't have a sign saying, "Welcome to Gath, home of Goliath." But at Gezer, we do have that. We have a lot of them, actually. We have what were called boundary stones, and you can see one just up on the right of the screen. There's a total of 13 that have been found. The first ones were discovered in the 1880s, and they're just carved into limestone bedrock, just on the side of the tell, all surrounding the tell, not directly on the tell, but they're actually marking borders of the agricultural community that was there. The most recent was found by a team at Southwestern. I'll talk a little bit later about our projects, but we do have a survey team, and they actually rediscovered one of the boundary stones that had been lost since about 1890, and then they discovered a new boundary stone just a couple of years ago. Most of them have a 2-line inscription, only 2 lines, and the first one will say region of Gezer in Hebrew, and the bottom will be belonging to Alkios in Greek. And these date to the time of the Seleucid and the Maccabean conflict, right around the 3rd century BC. Like I said, they mark the boundaries of probably the agricultural extent, the property of Gezer. But this is fantastic because it leaves the site in very little doubt, no doubt, as to the identification. Usually, like with Telasophy, you have the site name, it's Gath, but then it takes you about a decade to kind of convince the community, and maps and stuff are slow to come around on it. But this is very convenient. We have the topography of the tell. It's basically a saddle shape that's just about split down the middle, as you can see, with 2 large mounds. It sits in the AIJLON Valley, and as I mentioned, there's not a lot of fantastic natural resources in the area. There's a spring that sits just off to the southeast, but it's not rich like some other areas in the Shvela. The history of research at Gezer is very important to the excavation of the site. It's one of the most excavated sites in Israel. So when Southwestern went back in 2006, a lot of people were like, well, why are you doing this? It's been excavated. Well, there are a lot of questions still to be answered. The first systematic excavation, and those are hard quotes, was done by R.A.S. McAllister, who was a part of the Palestine Exploration Fund. And I put systematic in quotes because it's very unfortunate for us. Eric yesterday mentioned that he had a question about, well, how long can you excavate a site? And the answer is basically, well, forever. And that's because we go very slowly now, and we're very systematic, and everything's recorded. In just about 6 years, in the first decade of the 20th century, McAllister excavated completely 50% of Gezer. 50%, half of the site. It's a huge site. And basically what he did was he dug enormous trenches all along the site. And so he'd dig one trench, just a huge trench, and then when he dug a second trench, he would take all the dirt from that trench and dump it in his first trench. So there's no recording and no processes. You can't really piece together anything that he did from his reports. Now we excavate in squares in a grid fashion so we can keep track of everything as we go down. The artificial walls or balks of the square give us a record of the stratigraphy as we dig, so that if you do make a mistake, you can kind of check your mistake. But when you dig a huge trench and backfill. There's no going back. Archaeology is a destructive science, so you really get one shot at it. And so about half of the Tel of Gezer has been destroyed by the man on the left. That's actually a picture of him at Gezer. What he was searching for, as many archaeologists were at that time, were museum pieces. And you see all of those beautiful pots next to him, which mean almost nothing because we don't know where they came from. He found many statues and figurines, a very famous inscription that I'll mention in a little bit, as well as some large monolithic, this high place area, but almost none of it could be rescued just because of his methodology was very poor. And unfortunately for us, but lucky for the people at Tel Gezer, he went to Tel Gezer first, but through a range of issues, he couldn't get along with the locals, etc. He left Tel Gezer and went over to Gezer, where he destroyed everything. Just an idea, he identified about 8 levels of occupation at Gezer with his incredibly fast methods, just 8 different ones. The site was excavated again around World War I, but wasn't published until recently by Aaron Mayer, the director of the Tel Gezer site. If I mentioned Safi a lot, my experiences are there. It's also a sister site in the Shfela of Gezer, so there's a lot of similarities or things that they can draw from each other. In the 60s and 70s was the next systematic excavation, and it was really a great one, led by, for the most part, Bill Deaver, who, if you're familiar with archaeology at all, you've probably heard the name Bill Deaver. And he served as director, and they actually identified 21 levels of occupation compared to the 8 that McAllister had. So that's kind of what systematic excavation can do for you. And I'll talk kind of as we go on about a couple things they rescued from the McAllister excavations. And we have McAllister on the left to the most recent director, which is Dr. Steve Ortiz on the right. And he's the director of the Tandy Institute at my school at Southwestern Baptist, as well as directs the excavations at Gezer. He was a student of Bill Deaver's, who dug Gezer in the 60s and 70s. This is the Gezer Calendar, and this was found by McAllister. This was found by McAllister, and I know Eric talked about this yesterday. It's kind of a calendar. It's kind of a chores list. It's somewhere in the middle. Some have suggested that it's kind of a children's rhyme writing practice, which isn't usually thought very highly of as a theory. But no one really knows, and again, it comes out of no context. So just based on the epigraphy and the writing style, they call it Phoenician or Paleo-Hebrew, which is early Hebrew, not like a no-carb, no-dairy Hebrew. But it's dated to around the 10th century, but no one really knows because we don't have any context for it. And it's one of the most famous inscriptions to come out of the land, and like I said, we have no context for it, so we can't say an awful lot about it. I'm going to move through some of Gezer's history. I'll focus on the Middle Bronze Age, which is about 2000 to 1500, the Late Bronze Age, and then really focus kind of on the Solomonic city of Gezer. But looking here at the Late Bronze Age, these are the monolithic stone structures that were discovered by McAllister. Fortunately, they didn't tear up this whole area, so Deaver and HUC in the 60s and 70s were able to come back and excavate around to confirm the date of the Middle Bronze Age for this structure. When they actually found most of these, they were on their sides, but they were reconstructed in the 60s and 70s, and they're still standing. You can see the picture on the right was taken in the late 60s, and just as they had reconstructed them, and the picture on the left, which is from the opposite side, was taken this year at Gezer. So they're still standing. You can still see them. They're reconstructed very well. As I said, they were able to be rescued by the HUC team, which is fantastic for us. It's often just called the high place at Gezer. The publication is very recent on it. But some of those stones, you have the man for scale there. That's a normal-sized man. But some of those stones are up to about 3 meters in height. And some of them, as you can see, are very small. And right in the middle, there's a type of stone altar. And the interesting thing about all of the stones is that they're in a direct north-south orientation. And like everything in archaeology, if you've taken an archaeology class or read much, when you can't really explain something, you just call it cultic. It might be a a child's toy, but it's cultic because we don't know, and that sounds kind of scholarly, so it's cultic. These are cultic. And there's been a lot of different suggestions on it because there's not a ton of information. In fact, in the 60s and 70s excavation, they found nearish. They found some infant remains, so it was thought, oh, well, maybe the Canaanites are sacrificing children here. Sure is possible, but no one really buys that. There's not enough evidence for that, but it's something kind of fun to say. For now, Dee excavated it in the 60s and 70s, and basically what he's come up with, and the publication was just about, that actually came out maybe 3 months ago, and they're basically calling it the center of a covenant renewal ceremony, which is another way to say cultic. That's nothing really new. It's just kind of it's just some type of ceremony. Nothing fantastic. Not as cool as Stonehenge. They had the aliens build theirs, but this one, they were busy at Stonehenge probably doing their own restoration work, and so we just have a covenant renewal ceremony. Maybe, fingers crossed, child sacrifice, but there's not enough evidence for that. We have some more MB at Gezer, and to see these in person is a lot more impressive than it is here. But on the left, we have a tower at Gezer. It's a Middle Bronze tower. The tower is 52 feet in width, and it's estimated that there's probably about 25 of these towers around the Middle Bronze city wall. This here, the one on the left, I believe is still the largest Middle Bronze Age defensive structure that's been excavated and is still standing. And during the Middle Bronze Age, again, if you've taken an archaeology class or studied some of the archaeological history of Palestine, you know that in the Middle Bronze Age, they built huge fortifications. If you've seen the Telasophy lecture or been to Telasophy, you know that down at Area F at the bottom, where Eric's worked for a long time, there's the huge Middle Bronze wall that's down at the bottom. And it is no different here at Gezer. Gezer was one of the larger Middle Bronze sites in Palestine during this time. And again, the tower on the left, the picture does not do it justice. On the right is the gate, the Middle Bronze Gate. And it's about 4 meters wide, and it's very difficult to see. I was hoping they'd come off a little better. I can see it here, but I don't think you can see it there. If you can see some of the color striations on the right picture, some of the deeper red, those are actually complete mud bricks that are still there from the Middle Bronze. Those aren't reconstructed. They're not spray painted or anything. Those are mud bricks that are still left standing. On a wall like this, they would have a stone foundation, a very large stone foundation, and then a large mud brick superstructure that could be very tall on top of it. And on some of these sites, you get some of the mud bricks that are well preserved, and it just sits in the sun and basically bakes, and then it's still there today. So I hope you can see some of the red, and it's quite impressive in person. This is something just for your reference as we go forward. These are the current excavation areas, and I'll have this slide a bit later. But Field 3 on the right side of your screen and Field 7 on the top left were both from HUC. They were the Gezer excavations in the 60s and 70s. And Field 7 is over there near where all the Middle Bronze stuff I just showed you is, as far as the gate and the tower. Up north of this, straight up off of the picture, is where the large monoliths were. And Field 3 is right around, which we'll talk about a bit later, the 6-chambered so-called Solomonic Gate. And here are our current excavations area. We have Field East and Field West. East because it's on the east, west because it's on the west. And the bottom dotted line is around our casemate wall, which we'll also talk about a little later. So it's actually quite nice while excavating. If you've been to Telasophy or other places, you've seen the excavation areas are very spread out. We're all very cozy. So if you like the people, that works out really nicely. Late Bronze Age Gezer. During the Late Bronze Age, we're now looking at around 1500 to 1200 BC. And actually, the Middle Bronze Age, right at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, I had mentioned earlier that Gezer is right on that key kind of crossway in Palestine, and it was destroyed at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, most likely by Thutmose III, coming up from Egypt. Again, it's on that route from Egypt up the Via Maris. And just in general, Palestine, Israel is kind of known as the land bridge. The most famous atlas collection of maps is called the Sacred Bridge, because it's a bridge between much larger and grander civilizations throughout time. So it's a lot of collateral damage that happens. So when it's destroyed by Egypt, Egypt basically becomes a big bully throughout the late Bronze Age, and they control most of Palestine. This time is dominated by Egypt. It's great for archaeologists because we get the destruction. It's also great because we get a lot of cool finds, like this scarab. And Egypt really influences a lot more trade with Cyprus and various places. So we get a lot of fantastic different types of pottery and just imported items and artifacts throughout the late Bronze Age. So this is a scarab that was discovered in 2013 at Gezer. This is the cartouche of King Amenhotep III. And since I don't know any hieroglyphics, you're just going to have to trust me. I can't parse that out for you. As we go into the Egyptian finds that we had last season with the destruction in the late Bronze Age, it's kind of important to remember how Egypt is able to assert its power north and how it's able to do this. They, of course, have the Nile, and when you have the Nile River and you're able to, all of your basic needs are met, and you have this large state versus in Palestine, you have all these city-states. You have Gezer, you have Tel-Gezer, they're all separate, and they're not united in any way. When you have a larger united state that doesn't have to rely on the outside for any of its food, any agriculture, any water, anything like that, it gives them the ability to look outside of itself for domination. And this is a cylinder seal that was also found in 2013. It was found near the scarab along with a ton of whole vessels. And here is a story about not whining. One of my friends was digging in this area the first week of excavation last season. But because it was some late bronze stuff and he wasn't finding anything especially cool, he started complaining that he wanted to work in an area that was more towards his research aspects, which was basically, I want to find better stuff. And what ended up happening was they switched him with someone else, and the very next day, that person found the scarab, an entire cache of cylinder seals, and several whole vessels. And so the student who complained feels very dumb. That's the cylinder seal rolled out. You can see it twice rolled out. In green, we have the LB levels, just to note some of the architecture, and those are butting up against and right beneath the Iron One walls. And we didn't really spend much time on the Iron One, but you can note the stratigraphy, you can note how close everything is. And if you remember that picture of the Tel, where everything's just right underneath each other, sometimes you can move several meters and you're still within one occupation. Sometimes you move 20 centimeters and you've jumped 1,000 years. It just depends where you're at on the Tel. And that's why we go slowly, and that's why we record and excavate very carefully. This also, if you can see right behind Marcella, who is sweeping there for the picture. She's actually not sweeping, she's faking. This is called a gazelle in archaeology. So they're there for scale, and to kind of show you a scale and add some different color to the picture. So she's lying. But you can see she's right on the edge of the cliff. So this gives you an idea that as we move through time, not everything's built on the same city plan from one period to the next. You can see the topography, the soil, the edge of the cliff will change. You can see that's further out than the Iron One city, which has those fortification walls. It's also important kind of on that thought to remember the dates we're throwing out. We remember America's 250-ish years old. And, when I say Middle Bronze Age and I say 2000 to 1500, that's double the life of America already. So you think of the amount of climate change and just the topographical changes that can happen over 500 years. You have to kind of keep that in mind when we're throwing out these dates from one period to the next, just how much time actually passes. And even though their technology and such doesn't develop quite as quickly, a lot of time has passed. So some of the natural resources and such will change over time. Here we have a large LB pillared building. It doesn't seem that exciting, and that's because it's not. But you have these throughout Palestine. You have one here at Gezer. Telecopy has one off the north end of the cliff in Area E, where Eric directed a couple of years ago. There's also one at Tel Timna, which is right in this area. And they're all very similar floor plans. They're all very similarly built. The sizes are a bit different. But, we kind of expect this because we have Egypt during this time kind of running the show, controlling all of the building projects. I mentioned in the Middle Bronze Age, you have everything being built up, all of the wall fortifications. They're just huge mud brick superstructures. In the Late Bronze Age, you don't have that. And a lot of people, the most common theory is that, well, Egypt wouldn't let them. And that's maybe challenged some, but it probably rings true that if Egypt is controlling, they don't want someone they're kind of ruling from afar to build up defensive fortifications. The other side of that is the Middle Bronze fortifications were fantastic despite 500 years passing. So they could a lot of times they're just reusing those. But these are usually given an explanation. It's possibly relating to Egypt or an Egyptian residence or administrative building, and we'll get into that. Kind of Egypt's administrative policies and tactics and Palestine here in a moment. Here is one pillar base from that building. And this is basically all you typically get when you have a pillar. You don't get the large, fantastic pillar that you might get at some classical Greek and Roman sites. If you've been to Rome, been to the Pantheon, you see those beautiful pillars. This is what you get. You get a round stone disc that's impossibly heavy to move, but you have to because you want to know what's underneath it. And so moving heavy rocks is a key part of this. But again, this building is similar to ones at other sites, and the pillar base. If you were at Eric's lectures, I'm sure he talked about the Philistine temple that's at Telecopy, right? Yep. And so you all paid attention. No one was sleeping. There's a few maybe now, but you have the pillar bases, and it's reminiscent at Telecopy of the story of Samson, and they talk about that. This would be long before then, but Eric probably had that nice slide with the buckets on top of the pillar bases. The Amarna Tablets and Gezer. The Amarna Tablets are one of the most magnificent finds in archaeology and Near Eastern archaeology. These were clay tablets that consisted of diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and various essentially vassals or parts of its kingdom or other societies during the Late Bronze Age. And we'll focus on the ones in Canaan. The letters were found at Tel Amarna, and I'll show a map in a second. And Tel Amarna is in Egypt, and it's in Upper Egypt, which is, of course, in the south. And the capital was moved there during this time, during the Late Bronze Age, by Akhenaten. And if you don't know about Akhenaten, he was around in the mid-14th century. He's best known as the heretic pharaoh. There's lots of books written that are just called the heretic pharaoh, and it's all about Akhenaten. And he's a heretic because he moved from the many gods of Egypt to monotheism, moved the capital. Before you want to call him like a proto-Hebrew or Christian or think you have some affinity with him through monotheism, he worshiped the sun disk. It was really a political move. The priests had a lot of power in ancient Egypt while he was there. And so basically him and his mother decided to worship one God. They got rid of all the priests and all the money that went to the priests and the temples and just consolidated power. But because they moved kind of out of the Nile south, or out of the Nile Valley, more further south, we get these fantastic tablets because it was in a much more drier site that could preserve these tablets. It is interesting because they're written in cuneiform, if you can see, which is basically little golf tees that they pressed in the clay. And it's written in cuneiform, which is the language of Mesopotamia more than it is Egyptian. No hieroglyphs on them. There are 382 known tablets, and most of them say very similar things. They're not very creative, maybe in some of their metaphors. I'll read a couple off to you here in a second. But most of them say very, very similar things. They're whining, they're complaining about their neighbor. I love you, king of Egypt. You're so beautiful. My neighbor hates you. He's the worst. That neighbor says the same thing, maybe a little different language. It's just a lot of tattletelling basically going on in Canaan during this time. And here's a couple of quotes just from random tablets. And these are in this style written on several of these tablets. A brick may move from under its partner, still I will not move from under the feet of the king, my lord. And so basically he's saying, you saw the mud bricks, which are still in place from the Middle Bronze Age to now, that he loves the king of Egypt more than that mud brick will stay there, which is quite the metaphor. You have another one. I looked this way and I looked that way and there was no light. Then I looked towards the king, my lord, and there was light. And this one is really great. I usually pray this. Light is Jesus, and so I've kind of turned it into a worship song, but it works. But basically, they're just pledging ridiculous amounts of fealty to the king of Egypt, asking for help, asking for more food because they're completely dependent upon Egypt during this time, asking for more resources, asking him to come out and beat up his neighbor who doesn't respect the king of Egypt. Egypt's basically like the mafia during this time, and they're all just paying for protection and pointing fingers. And we have 4 tablets specifically that deal with Gezer. 298 is missing, no picture of it. It doesn't look like that. We have the Amarna tablet number 271, and where it talks at Gezer, from Milkili, mayor of Gezer, King, the war against me and Shuardata, mayor of Hebron, is severe. Save your land from the power of the Habiru. And the Habiru are this nomadic tribal people that are causing trouble for a lot of these people during this time. Because of the etymological similarities to the Hebrews, there's been a lot made of that, and I will not get into any of that today. Amarna tablet number 287. From Abdi Heba, mayor of Jerusalem, to King Pharaoh. They are now attempting to take Jerusalem. Pharaoh has placed his name in Jerusalem forever. He cannot abandon the land of Jerusalem. Gezer, Ashkelon, and Lachish have given oil, food, and supplies to the Habiru. So basically, Jerusalem is complaining that everyone else has abandoned Egypt and is helping these nomads take over places. You also see this a lot in the Amarna tablets. You see them kind of call, and you see this in the biblical text as well, in Psalms mainly, where they say things, your name reigns forever, God. You can't abandon me now. You've said you'll take care of me. And they're kind of doing that here. The name of Pharaoh has placed his name in Jerusalem forever. Well, Pharaoh's placed his name there. Surely he can't abandon them. Amarna 298. From Yaphahu, mayor of Gezer, to Pharaoh. May the king be informed that my younger brother, having become my enemy, entered Muhatsu and pledged himself to the Habiru. So it's a lot of this same Habiru stuff. He's even turning on his own family here. And the final, Amarna tablet 299, from Yaphahu, mayor of Gezer, to Pharaoh. My God, my son, the sun from my sky, the Habiru are stronger than we. Send help and save me from the Habiru, lest the Habiru destroy us. So again, it's a lot of that same stuff that about Gezer, for Gezer, against Gezer. And here's a couple of maps. You can see Akhenaten, which is El Amarna, in the purple, just above the words Upper Egypt. And that's where Akhenaten moved the capital to. And then you can see the map on the right, which is basically showing the major polities where Egypt had set up governors or residences where they're controlling Canaan from. And the arrows pointing of everyone just kind of blaming everyone. The arrows, everyone's guilty, everyone's claiming innocence. But this is really the geopolitical situation in the Shephelah, there's really no loyalty within each other, which probably contributed to the fact that they were able to be taken so easily by Egypt in the first place. We have the Merneptah Stele. This is best known as the Israel Stele or Victory Stele. I won't talk a lot about it, but it's one of the most fascinating finds for studying the history of ancient Israel. I'll go ahead and read this section. Not the cartoons yet. Ashkelon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Yanoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste, and his seed is not. Huru is become a widow of Egypt. So here you have Gezer mentioned alongside Israel as groups that were captured or destroyed by Merneptah. Now, one thing, of course, you can't always trust someone who's writing their own history. History is written by the winners, quite literally in this case. And what you do have with Israel, why it's so interesting, is because the hieroglyphic determinative, this is kind of really behind baseball and boring, it really points to them as a people without a home, more as a traveling nomad group than a group with a city, than a city that was destroyed. So speaking maybe as in the wilderness or not yet a people that do have a homeland. Looking in the biblical text, Gezer is mentioned quite a bit in the biblical text. Usually just throughout the historical books. In Joshua and Judges, you have the Canaanite coalition that Joshua is told to destroy. Then Horam, king of Gezer, came up to help Lachish. This is Joshua 10:33. And Joshua struck him down and his people until he left none remaining. None remaining is the key. I don't know about you, but this is my favorite genocide passage in the Bible. And again, the key is none remaining. It also reinforces Gezer as a border site. You have Joshua 16:3, then it goes down westward to the territory of the Japhletites as far as the territory of Lower Beth Horon, then to Gezer, and it ends at the sea. Since it's on those roads that I mentioned, it's a marker, it's a marking point when you're divvying up territory. You have unfulfilled conquest, and this is Lego genocide, I think. However, in Joshua 16:10, they did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, so the Canaanites have lived in the midst of Ephraim to this day, but have been made to do forced labor. And that's repeated again in Judges 1. You have David's victory over the Philistine. These photos are actually pictures of some of the Philistine pottery from Gezer. There's not a whole lot, but there is some. And you have, and David did as the Lord commanded him and struck down the Philistines from Geba to Gezer. So here you have, later in David, he's after Joshua, he's after Judges. They were complaining about the Canaanites who still lived in Gezer because they didn't kill all of them. And then you have David who drives the Philistines back to Gezer. So presumably, Gezer is Philistine, but not necessarily ethnically. More than likely, Gezer at this time had the remnant of Canaanites living there. But was politically, culturally controlled by the Philistines, at least according to the biblical text, because we don't have the same percentage of pottery, of Philistine pottery and finds that they do at a site like Gath. And again, we'll ask the question, were there Philistines at Gezer? Again, it just comes down to the fact that the job was not finished in Joshua and Judges, and so the biblical author is hearkening back that because they didn't follow God's guidance when they took the land, they're dealing with this Philistine issue now and losing out on a key site. The control of Gezer was very important. Now we have 1 Kings 9, 16, and 17. Possibly Seomun's destruction of Gezer, but it's the unknown Pharaoh, since it's only listed here in the biblical text. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and captured Gezer and burned it with fire, and had killed the Canaanites who lived in the city, and had given it as dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife. So Solomon rebuilt Gezer and Lower Beth Horon. Wedding registry, I registered for my wedding, which was probably the funnest thing in wedding planning that I got to do. But as much as I clicked that thing, there was never a site, a complete city for me. Only toasters and coffee makers, and they break. But the city's still there. The fortified royal cities, this is where the archaeology really starts with the biblical text to mesh, or where people really start trying to mesh it as far as this is concerned. And this is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon drafted to build the house of the Lord and his own house, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hatzor, and Megiddo, and Gezer. This has been a long contentious verse, just because of the architectural styles that are at these three sites, Megiddo, Hatzor, and Gezer. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. This is really kind of the crux of, one of the main cruxes, one of the main debates in archaeology today, or if you want to use the term biblical archaeology, is the nature of the 10th century. And while I assume most people in this room take the Bible fairly as it is and would most obviously believe in a literal historical David, it's a tiny David on the left and Solomon on the right, about to maybe cut a baby in half, but he doesn't, spoiler alert. What you have is the rest of archaeology and those using the biblical text. This is the debate. Were there a David and Solomon? Was there a kingdom? There's been plenty of channels, shows on the History Channel and other programs that discuss this debate. And a lot of it just comes down to chronology and where you date things. So one person can look at a piece of pottery and say, oh, that's from the 10th century. And another says, oh, that's from the 9th century. And so they're both looking at the same pottery, and they're both calling it Iron 2A, but they're just saying it dates to different times. And so finding the 10th century is really, if I had to break it down of what our research goal is at Gezer today, this is finding the 10th century. And as you can see here in that field 3, we do have the gate complex that is there, and I'll show a couple better slides of that. And you do have, right in this area, the only 10th century that's really been found on the site, apart from the gate and this casemate wall. And where we're digging here in Field East is to find the 10th century. And because I showed you the picture of the Tel earlier, as it's stratified, it's difficult. You have a lot of stuff to get through before you can get to the 10th century. You can't just show up and say, I'm going to go to the 10th century over here. You have lots of other material to get through that you can't ignore. And here's a schematic of our excavation areas at Gezer. Of the gate complex and the casemate wall. You do have the chambers on the gate. You can see 6 chambers. You can count them out there. I can probably even shine a laser for you. No, I can't. Then you also have the casemate wall, and the casemate wall is basically the rectangles coming along the wall, running left to right. And basically it's just a double-sided wall that in times of defense where they would need to kind of be protecting from an outside invasion, they could fill the casemate with various items that basically made it just an incredibly thick wall without having to build a wall that was actually that thick. So you saved resources, time, and energy, but also had a very, very nice fortification system. Here's just another pic. The casemate wall guards Gezer to the south. It sits in the central valley of the AIJLON. Valley. And you can see in that very complex drawing just the elevations that remain from the gate complex and the casemate wall. Here's another view, just a better view with the gate. You can see the chambers quite clearly. You can also see the casemate very well here as well. You can see where it's deteriorated along the edge of the Tel coming left. But when people come to Gezer, when we have groups come and visit, whether it's other archaeological sites or whether it's just a touring church group, this is where they want to go. There's a ridge just up above with plaques that describe everything. This is what they want to see because this is what is believed to be Solomon's architecture. When he fortified Gezer, Jerusalem, Hatzor, and Megiddo, this is what is believed to have been built. And here's the 3 sites, Megiddo, Hatzor, and Gezer. I didn't have a great picture of Megiddo, so that's the drawn schematic. But you can see the obvious similarities that exist in these gate complexes. And so you can make the obvious logical conclusion that when you see these three similarities, they would be connected whether the biblical text was there or not. When the biblical text makes a claim, a large portion of scholarship will try to minimize that claim, and so that's, you see the chronology get knocked down and stuff like that. But it is clear that these three are very similar, and the majority would date them to the 10th century. Now I talked a little bit about the high and low chronology, and I would remind you that the biblical text, if this all does turn out to be 9th century, which is possible certainly, it doesn't really matter for us looking at the Bible, because you do have the biblical text that says Solomon fortified these three cities, but as I read the verse, you saw he never said, or the biblical author never said, Solomon built a 6-chambered gate and casemate walls at these three cities. So these are the similarities that we find, these are the connections we make, but it's important to remember in using the biblical text, interpreting it properly as we also interpret the archaeological data properly, and not trying to put too many restraints on the text of things we've already decided. The tearing down. Destruction is the greatest thing in the world for archaeology. It's the best. If Godzilla came through here right now, this would be a fantastic archaeological site in like 100 years. And fire's even better. If someone could come through and burn it all after that, and then just let it sit for a long time, we'd be really happy. And that's because when a cataclysmic, immediate destruction happens, everything is left in place. If it's a slow exile, or if it's people slowly migrating out of a city, you don't get everything left there. You don't get all the whole vessels. You don't get all the items. Why? Because they're taking most of them with them. So Godzilla plus fire would be ideal, but we will settle just for some good old-fashioned warfare and destruction. Pillars and tubs, you can see the arrow is pointing, and it's maybe difficult to see a pillar that actually still exists, laying on its side. And you can see in the foreground this large tub, which actually is not a tub. Solomon's bathtub, as its nickname is, this is from the 10th century. This is from the HUC's excavations. But you can actually see the grooves in it, and it's a type of oil or wine press. But it's not a common type. I don't think there's another one like it. But you can see the grooves or where the rods may have been pressed to help in the crushing process or draining. It's not really known. Eric will figure that out for us. He'll tell you next year, I promise. But as we're winding down, I kind of want to show you. Oh, that just blew that. Just on the other side, where those yellow lines are, mark out where that bathtub was, where the oil vat was, or the basin. And that's the 10th century floor level. So we knew when we started this year, this is what we had in front of us. We had this square. And so we went from this to that in one season this year. And it's very impressive. If you're not impressed, you should be, because that's architecture that's still standing, that's 1.5 meters high, which you usually don't get. This is really quite fantastic to have the 10th century at Solomon City preserved like this. We're starting to have a large plan of a building, but I'll show you just as we came down. This is the area I worked in. I'll just kind of show you a microcosm to explain the larger destruction and our process at Gezer. As we came down, this was just down maybe 30 centimeters or so. You can see all the tumbled stones. You can see all of the debris. It's just kind of nasty to pick through. It's not clean soil. It's just a lot of stuff that has tumbled on each other. As we move down, there's some of the other large tumble stones, which each one had to be carried out, every one. And I had mostly girls in my area, so I did a lot of carrying rocks. A lot of stones were carried by me. Those are all gone now, but you can see the meter stick in the corner. And this is just as we came down, that we have more and more of this tumble. And what we found, because it was a cataclysmic event that all happened at once, we had various parts of animals, so we think it was some type of room that housed animals, either that they were brought in to eat or brought in to be slaughtered, etc. But you can see on the left and right, I hope it's clear enough, you can see two different halves of jaws. They were both cows, but different animals, and only a half of each one that were found as we went down through the destruction. We also had more parts of animals. We had on the left, you have a bin, And we'll have another picture of that bin in a second, but right in the middle is a press weight for the olive oil industry, which Eric showed some pictures of those, but it's reused here to make an animal bin. And that's a horn, ram or goat, not entirely certain. We also found zoomorphic vessels, so not really animals, but I'm cheating a little bit, but they're in the shape of animals. This is just an overhead shot so you can see what the square looked like when we were finished. And then I'll finish with this. This was an incredibly fortunate find, not in that main room, but just in the alley next to it, which you can see from that view. We had this, and it was a small piece of bone or ivory that we just barely found. We actually used a sifter, like a kitchen sifter, to go through, and as we went, we found more and more pieces by sifting, several hours, moving maybe 2 centimeters of dirt, finding small piece by piece what turned out to be the game of 20 squares, bone or ivory with game pieces. And it's quite a fantastic find. There's only one in the world. As I'm running out of time, these are what you usually find them in. You usually find them carved on stone, very crudely done. And then that one at the bottom was found in Cyprus at Inkami, and you can see the top of it, which is what we have. It's the top inlaid to a box for this game of 20 squares. You can go on the British Museum's website and play the game online. It's very fun. But this is a very elite piece, so it speaks to maybe the elite nature of the city. Like I said, we just found it this year. It hasn't even been declared for certain if it was bone or ivory. But it is a quite fantastic find, and that room has only been excavated maybe 30 centimeters wide. So we're hoping down through this destruction, as we had all of those finds that I just showed you, that we'll continue to find more of that to understand the destruction by Shishak after Solomon's reign in about 925 in the 10th century. And that is all. Thank you very much.